In order to beat Elden Ring, it is important that you keep your HP above 0 while lowering your enemy's HP to 0 in order to defeat them. The way that we can do this is by causing damage to enemies. Fortunately, Elden Ring tells us exactly how much damage each of our attacks does to each enemy, and that is what this number represents. Now, with this number we have two options. We can accept that it is truly the damage that we are dealing, in other words, we can believe that the game is telling us the truth, or we can try to see it for ourselves. We can try to figure it out and check Elden Ring's math in order to make sure that we are not getting cheated out of some additional carnage. In this video, we are going to go over every single aspect of Elden Ring's damage and even calculate it ourselves in order to understand exactly how and why the numbers on the screen are what they are. My dear viewer, by the time we are done, you will be able to find out exactly how much damage each attack in the game does. Let's get started. Whenever we calculate exact damage numbers for any game, there are two basic things to take into consideration. We have to understand the strength of the attacking entity, and we have to understand the strength of the defending entity. In order to figure out Elden Ring's damage, the first thing to do is understand how it calculates a character's attack power. We will be going over three basic concepts in this regard: base attack rating scaling, and motion values. The most basic and easiest to understand concept is base attack rating. This is the base power of the weapon that we are using. It is predetermined by the game, and it is possible to see it clearly in the weapon stat page. There is only one way to increase the base attack rating of a weapon, and that is by upgrading it at a blacksmith. This, of course, means that base attack rating has a limit. Once we upgrade a weapon to its maximum level, plus 25 or plus 10, its base attack rating will never increase again. This is the basic metric for all damage calculations in the game, and probably the most important factor in increasing our final damage output. We want as much base attack rating as possible. It is obvious, but it cannot be overstated. Much more complex is the concept of attack rating scaling. It can also be referred to simply as damage scaling. This is an additional amount of attack power that a weapon receives based on the present stats of the character that is wielding it. Attack rating scaling is added to a weapon's base attack rating in order to obtain the total attack rating of a weapon. The players are able to see a weapon's attack rating scaling and total attack rating in the stats page as well. All of this information is clearly identified within the game. That being said, how does it work? As mentioned before, attack rating scaling is based on the stats of the character wielding the weapon, so we need to focus on this. The first thing to take into consideration is stat requirements. Every weapon in the game has requirements in order to wield them. This means that we need to have a minimum of some specific stats in order to be able to use the weapon effectively. Armaments in Elden Ring can have requirements in strength, dexterity, intelligence, faith, and arcane. They can have 1 requirement, 2 requirements, or 4 requirements, and we must meet all of them in order to be successful with the weapon. If the character meets the weapon requirements of an armament, it will be able to take advantage of attribute scaling and increase the armament's base attack rating with additional attack rating scaling. On the other hand, if the character does not meet the weapon requirements, then the character will see that the weapon's attack rating scaling will lower the base attack rating. Being more specific, the weapon will receive an attack rating penalty of 40% of its base attack rating if the character does not meet the requirements. As you can see, using a weapon without the proper stats will give us a double punishment. First, we cannot take advantage of attribute scaling, and second, our base attack rating will be heavily reduced. But of course, it would be foolish to use a weapon without meeting its requirements, so it is safe to say that all characters will be able to take advantage of attribute scaling in order to increase a weapon's attack power. This means that the next step is to understand how that actually works. Attribute scaling in Elden Ring works through a letter grade system. Every attribute has a letter that represents how much additional damage scaling the weapon is receiving from each particular stat. The lowest amount of scaling a weapon can receive from a stat is 0, and this is represented by a dash within the game. The highest amount of scaling that a weapon can receive is an S scaling. From there, a full scale is built with the remaining letters E, D, C, B, and A. The game will show you the letter scaling for each stat on every weapon, so we can see what each weapon scales with. That being said, internally, Elden Ring is much more specific. In fact, every letter grade has a range of power, and this means that just because two weapons have the same letter, it does not mean that they have the same scaling. The details of the scaling system within the game are the following. As mentioned before, a dash means 0 scaling. There is no variation here. An E scaling can go anywhere between 0.01 to 0.24 points. A D scaling from 0.25 to 0.59 points. A C scaling from 0.6 to 0.89 points. A B scaling from 0.9 to 1.39 points. An A scaling from 1.4 to 1.74 points. And finally, the highest grade, an S scaling, is anything of 1.75 points and above. For example, a Heavy Giant Crusher plus 25 has an S scaling of 1.84 points. Unfortunately, we do not have this information available in-game, and we have to look at the files in order to determine the exact value for the scaling that each weapon has. That being said, this specific value is very much needed to reach the total amount of attack rating scaling that a weapon gets. But wait, there's actually more. Elden Ring has additional internal mechanics to calculate attack rating scaling. It is not just about the letter scaling, it is also about the scaling saturation. What does this mean? Scaling saturation is an internal mechanic that the game uses in order to determine how much of the total letter scaling a weapon actually gets. That's right, weapons do not always get the full power of their attribute scaling. Sometimes they only get 40%, while others they get 75%. So the question is, what determines scaling saturation? And the answer is attribute level. Why is it that when we increase our character attributes, for example strength, our damage goes up? Well, when we increase our attributes, the scaling saturation for that weapon goes up. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, because scaling saturation also varies on a weapon per weapon basis. So, what is the conclusion? Honestly, scaling saturation is also something that we have to look for in the game files. While this sounds like it could be a nightmare, Elden Ring does a good job of organizing weapons in different groups. This means that most weapons actually share the same type of scaling saturation. While we still have to look up each specific weapon, these groups make it a bit easier to understand. Let me give you a quick example. This is a Claymore plus 25. It was not infused down any path. This is just a regular Claymore upgraded to maximum level. This character has 55 strength, so we look up the scaling saturation of a Claymore at 55 strength, and we will find that it is 71.111027999%. For the sake of simplicity, let's round this down to 71%. This means that at 55 strength, this Claymore will get 71% of its total strength scaling. So now, let's put it all together. We know that attack rating scaling is represented by a letter grade that has specific ranges. We also know that the game uses a hidden saturation system in order to establish exactly how much of that scaling the weapon actually uses. The next step is finding out exactly how much attack rating scaling a weapon actually gets. The formula is simple. Attack rating scaling is equal to base attack rating multiplied by attribute scaling multiplied by scaling saturation. We have to use this formula for each attribute that the weapon has a scaling for. As you can see, it's very easy. We look up the information we need, run the numbers through a calculator, and wham bam, thank you ma'am, we got the total attack rating scaling for the weapon. Let's go back to the Claymore and run the numbers as an example. Again, this is a regular Claymore plus 25. it has a specific C scaling in strength of 0.73 points and a specific D scaling in dexterity of 0.51 points. We are running this claymore with 55 strength and 13 dexterity. The weapon's scaling saturation is 71.111027999% for 55 strength and 16.459585159% for 13 dexterity. What is the total attack rating scaling? Starting with strength, we take 338 multiplied by 0.73 and multiply that by 0.7111102799 for a total of 175.459350463. Then we have to do dexterity, which is 338 multiplied by 0.51 multiplied by 0.1645958159 for a total of 28.3730267448. The next step is to add both of these together, and we get a total attack rating scaling of 203.832377208. For the sake of simplicity, we will round this up to 204. If we take a look at the information of damage scaling that the game gives us, we will see that the Claymore gets 205 extra attack rating from scaling. This 1 point difference is the deviation from the different rounding that we are forced to do. The game rounds its values differently than I did, so 1 point got lost in calculation. That being said, you can see that this information and the formula that we're using is truthful, and we can use all of this to calculate manually within 1 point of accuracy the damage scaling of a weapon. The final piece of the attack power puzzle is a concept that is known as motion value. Personally, I learned about this concept while playing Monster Hunter World. In Monster Hunter, there are different weapons of different sizes, so there was a need to make damage values sensical in regards to each weapon. It would be silly for a large greatsword to do the same amount of damage than a sword and shield with a single slash. Motion values fix this by making sure that the big, slow weapons do more damage per hit than the small, fast weapons. In Elden Ring, the concept is very similar. Motion values can be understood as the in-game representation of the force of an attack. In Elden Ring, motion values change depending on which attack the character is doing. The most basic example is the comparison between an R1 and an R2. Why do R2s deal more damage than R1s if we are using the same weapon with the same attack power? The answer is motion values. The R2 of a weapon has a higher motion value, meaning a higher force than the R1 of the same weapon. As a result, R2s reach higher damage values. Once again, this is an attempt to balance the different attacks by making sure that the slow ones deal more damage than the fast ones. In this way, the risk of doing a slower attack has the higher reward of additional damage. Every single attack of every single weapon has a motion value, and this explains why we get different damage numbers from every attack. Once again, the information of motion values is one that we have to go searching for within the game files. That said, it is information that can be accessed and used. Let me give you a quick example. If we take a longsword, the R1 of this weapon has a motion value of 1. In comparison, the R2 of the longsword has a motion value of 1.25. You can see the difference, and it is huge. The longsword's R2 gets a 25% attack power bonus in comparison to the R1. Be careful though, this does not mean that it deals 25% more damage. Attack power is not the same as damage, and we will see this clearly later in the video. This information is important to remember when we are calculating damage because each different attack with different motion values will lead to different damage numbers. And so, we are now aware of all of the tools that we need in order to calculate the total attack power of a specific weapon attack. We know the base attack rating, we know the attack rating scaling, and we know the motion values. Next up, we need to put it all together. In order to obtain the total attack power of a single weapon attack, we need to use the following formula. Attack power is equal to base attack rating plus attack rating scaling, all multiplied by the motion value of the attack we are using. Once again, let's use the trusty Claymore as an example. We have the regular Claymore plus 25 with a base attack rating of 338 and an attack rating scaling of 205. If we do a delicious one-handed poke R2 with this weapon with a motion value of 1.25, what is the total attack power? Let's find out. Attack power in this case is equal to 338 plus 205, all multiplied by 1.25, which gives us 678.75. And there you have it. If we attack an enemy with this Claymore using a simple R2 attack, our total attack power will be 678.75. This number is not the damage that we will deal to the target. I will say it again. This is the total attack power of the R2 that we did. The next step in the calculation is to compare this total attack power that our attack has with the statistics of the enemy that we are attacking. So we have to move on to the next topic, which is how does defensive power actually work? As mentioned earlier in the video, if we are looking to calculate the final damage that our character will do, we need to look at the attacking entity and the defending entity. We have already gone over everything needed in relation to the attacking side, so now let's look at the different concepts needed in order to better understand the defending side. In this regard, we will be looking at 3 different concepts and how they work together. These are defense, negation, and the order of application. Defense is the most simple concept to understand in Elden Ring, but it is also the most complicated to execute. It is driven by a complex mathematical formula that changes depending on the conditions. The first thing to understand is that defense is the first barrier that attack power has to go through in order to deal damage to a target. The total defense of a character is determined by the armor that it wears plus the natural defense a character has derived from its stats. In order to increase your character's defense, you need to level up and you need to wear more protective armor. The amount of defense that our character has and the additional defense that we get from each armor piece can be seen in the stats page of the game. It is readily available information. The second thing to understand is that there are multiple types of defenses. There is physical defense and there is elemental defense. Physical defense is split into standard, strike, slash, and pierce types, while elemental defenses is split up into magic, fire, lightning, and holy types. Each attack in Elden Ring has a damage type, and each damage type must go through its corresponding defense. For example, if an enemy attacks you with a fireball, only your fire defense is relevant, and if you're attacked with a spear, only your piercing defense is relevant. A high holy defense is useless against a lightning bolt. It is obvious to understand, but it is extremely important to do so, especially when it comes to split damage weapons. Finally, the last thing to understand is how attack power is affected by the defense of the target. As mentioned before, it is driven by a complex mathematical formula that changes depending on the numbers. This is the formula. As you can see, it can be a bit overwhelming and intimidating. That said, we can digest it to make it so that everyone can understand it. Later in the video, we will be running a full calculation so that you can see how it works. But for now, let's focus on the basic principle. The first step is to take the total attack power of the attack and divide it by the target's defense. This will give you a result. We use this result and compare it to the different conditions in order to see which formula we'd have to use. For example, if an attack of 200 hits a defense of 100, 200 divided by 100 equals 2. Since 2 is less than 2.5, then we need to use the third formula in order to calculate the damage. Once we apply this formula, we will obtain the total damage that the target receives. Remember, attack divided by defense, compare the results with the conditions, and apply the correct formula. Now, It is very important to understand that the result that we get from this formula is not the damage that we will see on the screen. This is the damage that the target receives, not the damage that the target takes. Once we know how much damage the target receives, we need to see how much damage it actually takes, and for that, we need to move on to the next concept. Negation is also relatively simple to understand, and most importantly, it is very easy to calculate. Negation is the second barrier that an attack has to go through before the enemy takes damage. As we saw before, defense is the first barrier, and once it goes through that, it has to go through negation. The first thing to understand about this is that negation is a stat that is fully dependent on armor. Every armor piece that we use has its own damage negation stat. Once we have all of our armor pieces equipped, Elden Ring calculates the total damage negation that our character has. This is something that we can see in the stats page of our character. If you equip different pieces of armor, or also boost it with talismans, you will see that the negation changes depending on what you have currently equipped. There are also some consumables that can affect negation. The second thing to understand is that, much like defense, there are different types of damage negation. The types of damage negation are the same as we saw before. There is physical damage, split into standard, strike, slash, and pierce, and there is elemental damage, split into magic, fire, lightning, and holy. This is exactly like defense. Each attack must go through its corresponding damage negation. If we are attacked by a holy beam of energy, it will first go through holy defense and then through holy negation. In this case, magic negation is completely useless. Finally, we need to understand how damage negation works. The number that you see in the stats page of your character is the total damage negation that it has for that specific damage type expressed in percentage. For example, in this case, you can see that my character has a standard physical damage negation of 45.216. This means that this character will negate 45.216% of the damage that it receives. The result of this negation will be the total amount of damage that my character actually takes. To run a quick example, if my character takes an attack and it receives 500 damage after going through my defense, it will negate 45.216% of it, meaning that it will absorb 226.075 points of damage. Once we subtract the damage received from the damage negated, we get that my character will take a final total of 273.925 damage. This will probably be rounded to 274 points of damage taken. As you can see, damage negation is much easier to apply than defense. There is no need for mathematical formulas or conditions. It is a basic percentage calculation. We have talked about multiple things so far: defense, negation, and the damage the target receives in comparison to the damage the target actually takes. It can all seem a bit confusing, but it actually follows a simple system, and we're going to take a look at that system. As I like to call it, the order of application. So, right now, we know how the two pillars of defensive power work. We know the details of defense, and we know the details of negation. As mentioned, these two concepts work together in a system in order to calculate the total damage that a target takes when it is attacked. I like to call this system the order of application, and it is very important to understand it if we are to understand how damage works in Elden Ring. The system is actually very simple. Defense first, negation second. Defense is the first barrier and negation is the second barrier. Let's break it down. When we attack an enemy, we use our total attack power. We went over how to get this number earlier in the video. This total attack power is then applied to the target's defense. This first barrier is where we apply the complicated formula that we saw in the defense section. Once we do this, the result we get is the damage that the target will receive. But this is not the final amount of damage because, as you know, we now have to go through the second barrier, the target's negation. So, We take the damage that the target has received and we apply its negation stat. We reduce this damage by the percentage, and the result will be the total damage that the target will take. This is the number that will appear on the screen. Remember, total attack goes into defense first, and this will give us damage received. Then, damage received goes into negation, and this will give us damage taken. This is the order of application that the game follows for each and every attack. As you can see, it is easy to understand, but also extremely important for the calculations. If we do not apply the system correctly, the calculation will never be correct. Alright, my dear viewer, we have arrived at the moment of truth. We now understand everything about attack power and defensive power. We know the formulas and we know the systems. The time has come to apply all of this information and do a full damage calculation. A full example from the initial information all the way to the damage that will actually appear while we're playing the game. Let's start with the setup. We, the player, will be the attacking entity. We will be using a fresh vagabond character with these stats. No level ups. Our weapon of choice will be the old reliable longsword. It will be +0, meaning no upgrades. The vagabond has a starting strength of 14 and a starting dexterity of 13. The longsword +0 has a base AR of 110, and with these stats we get an additional 15 points of AR scaling. As a result, our total AR will be 125. Furthermore, we will be attacking with a standard R1 attack. This attack deals standard physical type damage and it has a motion value of 1. As for the defending entity, we will be attacking this guy. This is a Godric soldier, specifically the first one that we see when we go into the forest north of the Church of Ele. This Godric soldier has a defense of 100 against standard physical type damage and a damage negation of 0% against the same type. So, if we attack this enemy with an R1 from our longsword, how much damage will we do? The first thing to do is to figure out the total attack power of our attack. As we know, total attack power is equal to base AR plus AR scaling multiplied by motion value. Our longsword has 110 base AR plus 15 AR scaling multiplied by the motion value of 1. As a result, our total attack power with this attack is 125. Now, we need to apply this total attack power to the defensive system. Remember, defense first, negation second. Let's bring up the defense formula again in order to find out which one we need to use. We must divide attack into defense and compare the result with the conditional formulas. So, 125 divided by 100 is 1.25. We compare this result with the conditions and we can see that the proper formula to use will be the third one. We now apply this formula to the attack, and this is what we need to solve in order to get the amount of damage that this Godric soldier will receive. Now, in order to solve this, we need to expand the inner bracket by using the distributive law and then follow the standard order of operations. That said, since this is an Elden Ring video and not a math video, I am not going to bore you with the details. I'm just gonna go ahead and solve this for you. The result is 61.4593333 infinite. This is the total amount of damage that the Godric soldier will receive after we attack it with our longsword R1. But remember, damage received is not damage taken. In order to get the total damage that the enemy will actually take, meaning the number that will appear on the screen, we need to apply the second step of the system. We need to apply negation. In this case, it is extremely simple. The Godric soldier has a damage negation of 0% for standard physical type damage, and this means that there is no reduction. As a result, in this case, damage received will actually be the same as damage taken. The final conclusion is that when we attack the Godric soldier with an R1 of our longsword, it will take a total of 61.4593333 infinite damage. The game, of course, will use its own internal systems to round this damage either up or down, but for the purposes of our calculations, we can say that the enemy took a total of 61.5 damage. My dear viewer, let's check our work. We start a fresh game with the Vagabond, we move on to the Church of LA, and then head north to find our target. We enter battle and we execute the R1 of the attack. As you can see, the Godric soldier took a total of 61 damage, represented by this in-game number. The result of our calculation was 61.5 damage. The damage difference of 0.5 is due to the rounding that the game does. That said, the deviation is minimal, and, as you can see, we were able to properly and accurately calculate the damage in Elden Ring. At this time, we can confidently say that we are capable of understanding and calculating damage numbers in Elden Ring. That said, I do want to go over a few other things in order to create a complete guide, the first of which is split damage. I am sure that you know that some weapons in Elden Ring have two different kinds of damages: physical and fire, physical and magic, physical and holy, so on and so forth. It is important to understand how damage calculation work in these cases. While it does make things a bit complicated, it is not difficult to understand. The concept is as follows. When we attack with a weapon that has two or more different types of damage, we have to do the damage calculation for each damage type separately. Let's imagine a weapon that deals both standard physical damage and then also deals fire damage. The first thing to do is separate the physical AR and the fire AR. Then we apply each damage type to its corresponding defense and negation. So the physical AR will go through the physical defense and negation, while the fire AR will go through the fire defense and negation. Once we understand this, we apply the same system that we have been speaking about throughout the whole video. Defense first, negation second. I will not bore you with another set of calculations, but we have to do the exact same thing that we did earlier in the video, but we have to do it for each damage type separately. That means that we have to do two sets of damage calculations. One of the calculations will give us the physical damage the enemy will take, while the other will give us the fire damage that the enemy will take. Once we have both of these results, we add them together and we will get the total damage that appears on the screen. It's actually pretty simple stuff. The issue with this is that since we are going through two different defense values and two different negation values, our damage will, generally speaking, be lower than if we were just doing a single pure damage type. For this reason, and once again, generally speaking, split damage weapons will deal less damage than pure damage weapons if they have the same AR. The exception to this rule is obvious. If we are fighting an enemy that is weak to our specific damage type, for example, the giant Miranda Sprouts has a negative 40% fire negation. In that case, then split damage will be a better option. It is all a matter of matching the right option to the right enemy. Nevertheless, for the purposes of damage calculation of split damage weapons, the conclusion is simple. We have to do the same calculation that we always do, but we have to do it once for each damage type. The final subject that I want to go over in this video is spell damage. This information is exactly the same for both incantations and sorceries. All spells are included. In Elden Ring, spell damage works exactly the same as weapon damage does. We just have to look for the initial information elsewhere. When it comes to the actual damage calculation, it works exactly the same as we have explained earlier in the video. The total attack power of the spell is obtained by grabbing the spell scaling of the catalyst we are using to cast a spell. This is sorcery scaling for staffs or incantation scaling for seals. And then we multiply this number by the motion value of the spell that we are using. Much like with weapons, we have to go look into the game files for the motion value of each spell. As a quick example, this character is using a Dragon Communion Seal with 328 incantation scaling. We will be casting the incantation Lightning Spear. This incantation has a motion value of 2.34. We multiply these two values together and we get a total spell attack power of 767.52. Once we have this number, we do the exact same thing that we have been doing throughout this whole video. Defense first, negation second. In this case, since we are using the incantation Lightning Spear, we will apply this 767.52 attack power to the target's lightning defense and lightning negation. Like I mentioned, I will not bore you with any more calculations. The process is exactly the same as we have established it. Once we run through the whole process, we will get the total damage that our spell will do to the target. By now, you should be used to the system and you should be able to understand how it is applied to each spell, to each weapon, and, most importantly, to each damage type. I have to say, this was a very long video, and we have gone over some complicated topics. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Your patience, interest, and support is the #1 drive for this channel. My intention is to give my viewers all the tools that I have. This sometimes means that we have to go through some really heavy stuff, but I think that it is for the best in the end. Knowing how things work is never a bad thing. Whether you get a lot from this guide or just a little, I am still satisfied. The objective is that by the time you finish this video, you leave with a little bit more information than you had when you came in. If this is the case for you, then my work has been successful. Thank you very much for your time, and I do hope that I get to see you on the next one.